The man with no breath. I should have left the restaurant the moment I noticed he never exhaled, but by then it was already too late. The night started like any other first date, the kind that's supposed to be exciting, maybe a little awkward, but nothing more. The snow outside was relentless, coating the streets in a thick, quiet white. I met him at a cozy little restaurant just outside town, the kind that only locals know about. The place was warm, dimly lit, with soft jazz playing in the background. He was already seated when I walked in, tall, well-dressed, a calm smile on his face. "Claire?" he asked, standing as I approached. His voice was smooth, polite. I nodded, smiling, and sat across from him. His name was Daniel. We started with the usual small talk, jobs, interests, travel. He was charming, attentive, his eyes never leaving mine. But something felt off. At first I couldn't put my finger on it. The way the air around him seemed still, how his presence carried an odd kind of quiet. I brushed it off, blaming my nerves. Then, midway through our conversation, I noticed it. He would inhale, slowly, deeply, but never exhale. His chest rose, but it never fell. Not once did I see or hear him let out a breath. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Maybe I just wasn't paying close enough attention. But once I noticed, I couldn't stop watching. He would take a sip of his wine, swallow, then speak as if nothing was wrong. But I never saw his breath fog up in the cold air whenever the front door opened. I never saw the faintest puff of mist escape his lips. My stomach twisted. Something about it was fundamentally wrong. "Are you all right?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. His expression was concern, but his voice held something else. Amusement. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." He grinned, setting his glass down. "About what?" I hesitated. What could I say? "I think you forgot how to breathe." That would sound insane. Instead, I decided to test something. I reached for my wine, lifting it to my lips. As I took a sip, I made an exaggerated exhale, letting my breath fog up the air between us. He just watched me, unfazed. His own glass sat in front of him, the rim clean, untouched. I set my glass down, my fingers tightening around the stem. "You never exhale," I said before I could stop myself. His smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. "Would you like to know why?" My heart pounded. Every nerve in my body told me to stand up and walk out. But my body wouldn't move. The way he was staring at me, the way the candlelight flickered in his dark eyes, it felt like I was pinned in place. "I don't think I—" "Because," he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have nothing left to breathe out." A chill ran down my spine. He reached for his wine glass then, finally, and took a slow sip. But when he lowered it, the glass was still full. I stared at him, my pulse hammering in my ears. "What? You felt it, didn't you?" he murmured. "The stillness, the quiet. You've been noticing it since the moment you sat down." The restaurant had been full when I arrived. I knew it had been full, but as I glanced around now, the tables sat empty. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The waiter that had taken our order was nowhere to be seen. I swallowed hard. "Where is everyone?" Daniel just smiled. The candle on our table flickered violently, though there was no draft. I pushed my chair back, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I should go. He didn't move, didn't try to stop me. Of course. But as I stood, I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. My reflection in the window beside us. It was clear, solid, real. His was a blur, a faint wavering outline, like a figure drawn in fog. My legs locked. The air around me turned frigid. I could barely get the words out. "What are you?" His smile finally faded. Someone who should not have been given a second chance. I turned and bolted. I didn't look back. I shoved through the restaurant door out into the freezing night, my boots crunching against the thick snow. The cold air stung my lungs as I sucked in deep, desperate breaths. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands fumbled for the keys. My breath hitched when I saw the restaurant's reflection in my car's window. It was empty, not just of people, of everything. The tables, the chairs, the candles, even the building itself. Nothing but a dark, rotting shell, as if it had been abandoned for years. I turned back to look, and for the first time, I saw it as it truly was. The windows were shattered. The sign above the door hung loose, swinging creakily in the wind. The door itself was missing, leaving only a yawning black entrance, a place long forgotten. But the worst part, a man stood in the doorway, watching me. Not Daniel, not anyone, just a dark, human-shaped void, featureless, breathless. I didn't wait. I threw myself into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I sped away, my headlights flashed over something in the snow, a sign, half buried, weathered by time. Dunley's Restaurant, closed since 1984. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours scouring the internet, looking for any mention of Dunley's, of Daniel, of anything that could explain what I had seen. And I found it. The restaurant had burned down in 1984. A gas leak, dozens trapped inside. No survivors. Among the victims was a man named Daniel Reeves. His body was never found. I sat there, my screen illuminating my shaking hands. My stomach twisted as I scrolled down, eyes scanning the last known details of his life. Last seen alive, on a Valentine's Day dinner, with a woman named Claire. I stared at the screen, unblinking. It wasn't possible, it wasn't. A sharp gust of wind rattled my window. My reflection stared back at me. And behind me, just barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. Still, watching. I spun around. Nothing. Only the sound of my own ragged breathing. Or at least, that's what I told myself, because in that moment I realized something. The air around me was still, heavy, quiet. And the reflection in my window? I saw only one breath fogging up the glass. Not mine.
Pastry number 2, the whispering forest. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was the wind. The second time, I knew something was terribly wrong. It was supposed to be a perfect first date. A Valentine's Day sleigh ride through the snow-covered forest. A charming old-fashioned idea suggested by Ethan, the guy I had met just weeks ago. He seemed sweet, a little quiet, but something about him made me trust him. The snow was falling gently when we arrived at the edge of the woods where an old man waited with a horse-drawn sleigh. The air smelled of pine and frost, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. The driver barely spoke as we climbed in. His face was weathered, his hands rough as he gripped the reins. He gave us only one warning before we set off. If you hear whispering, don't listen. I laughed nervously, glancing at Ethan. He just smiled and shook his head, as if to say the old man was just trying to set the mood. The sleigh jolted forward, and soon we were gliding through the trees, surrounded by untouched snow. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the steady crunch of hooves and the occasional creak of the sleigh. Then the whispers started, soft, distant at first, like a breath of wind threading through the trees. I barely noticed them, mistaking them for the rustling of branches. But they grew louder, more distinct. The words were just out of reach, like voices speaking from behind a thick wall. I turned to Ethan, but he didn't seem to hear anything. He was staring at the trees, a strange look on his face. The old man snapped the reins suddenly, urging the horse to move faster. His jaw was clenched, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The whispers curled around us, pressing in, and for the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. Something was watching. I glanced over my shoulder. The path behind us had already disappeared under the heavy snowfall, but I swore I saw movement between the trees, something shifting, blending into the dark. My breath hitched. "Ethan," I whispered, gripping his arm, "do you hear that?" His expression was distant, unfocused, like he was listening to something else entirely. The old man let out a sharp breath. "Don't answer them," he muttered. His hands were white-knuckled on the reins. "Keep your eyes forward, keep your mouth shut." The voices grew more insistent, rising in pitch. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were calling, beckoning.
A gust of wind blew through the trees, and suddenly the cold felt different. It wasn't just winter's bite. It was something else, something deeper, a freezing, unnatural presence. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it didn't help. And then Ethan turned his head. His eyes went wide, his lips parted slightly. I followed his gaze. A woman stood between the trees. Her figure was barely visible, her dress blending with the snow, her skin pale as ice. She had no footprints leading up to where she stood. She was just there, watching us with hollow, empty eyes. The horse reared suddenly, nearly throwing us off the sleigh. The driver yanked the reins, his face a mask of terror. "Don't look at them," he snapped. Ethan didn't move. His breathing had changed, becoming shallow and strange. I grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "Ethan, don't listen, don't look at her." The whispering swirled around us, growing frantic, overlapping. "Come here, come closer, you belong with us." The woman's mouth opened, but her lips didn't move. The whisper came from everywhere. And Ethan, he was leaning forward.
I grabbed his coat, yanking him back just as the old man whipped the reins. The sleigh shot forward at an alarming speed, the trees blurring past us. My heart pounded against my ribs. I stole one last glance behind us. The woman was closer, much closer. She was standing in the middle of the path, directly behind the sleigh, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her mouth was still open, and I swear I saw something moving inside, writhing, shifting like shadows trapped beneath glass. The whispers screamed. Then just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The old man didn't slow the sleigh until we broke through the edge of the forest, the open road in sight. Only then did he pull the horse to a trembling stop. I was shaking. My hands were numb, my breath uneven. "Ethan?" He sat motionless beside me, his face pale, his eyes glassy. The driver turned in his seat, his expression grim. "Did he speak?" My voice barely came out. "No."
The old man exhaled, nodding slowly. "Good. If he had, he wouldn't have left the forest with us." Ethan didn't react. He just sat there, staring blankly at the road ahead. My stomach twisted. I grabbed his hand again, but his fingers were ice cold. "Ethan?" No response. I shook him. "Ethan, snap out of it." Finally, his gaze flickered, his lips parting. They knew my name. His voice was hollow, distant. They were calling me, like they knew me. I shuddered, gripping his hand tighter. "They don't. It was a trick. They were trying to get you to answer." The old man sighed. "You were lucky tonight. If he had answered them, if he had followed, you'd never have found him again." The horse let out a nervous whinny, shifting its weight. The old man patted its neck, then turned back to us. "I don't take couples into the forest on Valentine's Day anymore," he muttered. "Not after the last time." I swallowed hard. "What happened last time?" He hesitated, then murmured. A man answered the whispers. His date turned to stop him, but he was already walking into the trees. And... My voice came out barely above a whisper. The driver's eyes darkened. She tried to follow him, to pull him back, but there was nothing to pull back. He had vanished, just like that. No footprints leading away, no sign of him, as if he was never there. A chill ran down my spine. "He was taken," the driver murmured. "And the worst part?" His fingers tightened on the reins. 3 days later, she started hearing his voice in the forest, calling her name. A thick silence hung between us. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sound so faint, so distant, I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. Almost. A whisper, a voice, calling Ethan's name. Story number 3. The Ice-Cold Handprint. The first time I saw the handprint, I thought it was a trick of the light. The second time, I knew something was following us. It had started as the perfect first date. Valentine's dinner at a quiet little restaurant nestled between snow-covered streets. The air outside was crisp, our breaths fogging in the night. My date, Ryan, was charming in a quiet way. the kind of guy who seemed to observe more than he spoke. We had met through mutual friends, and though I wasn't sure what to expect, I'd felt comfortable around him. After dinner, we decided to take a walk. The streets were empty, the fresh snow untouched except for our footprints. The dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows, stretching and shifting with every step we took. We talked about nothing and everything, the cold biting at our cheeks, but neither of us wanted to end the night just yet. Then I saw it, a handprint, pressed against the back of Ryan's coat. At first I thought I was imagining things. It was faint, barely visible, but definitely there, a pale, frosted imprint of a hand, its fingers long and thin, the edges uneven like it had been pressed against ice. "Wait," I said, stopping in my tracks. "You have something on your back." Ryan turned, frowning. "What?" I reached out hesitantly, brushing my fingers over the print. The fabric of his coat was freezing beneath my touch, far colder than it should have been. My breath hitched. "Did you lean against something cold?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Ryan looked confused. "Number Y?" I hesitated, then shook my head. Nothing. Must have been my imagination. But as we kept walking, unease curled in my stomach. I told myself it was nothing. A smudge of snow, a trick of the light. Yet deep down, something felt wrong. A few minutes later, I glanced at Ryan again, and my breath caught in my throat. The handprint was back, only this time it was lower, near his waist. I stopped walking. The world felt too quiet, the night suddenly too still. The air around us carried an unnatural chill sinking into my bones. "Ryan," I whispered, my throat tight, "there's something on you." He frowned, but before he could respond, a gust of wind rushed past us. It was sharp, bitter, and it carried a whisper. I froze. My heart pounded violently against my ribs. It had been faint, almost too soft to hear, but it was there. A voice, distant yet suffocatingly close. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of it sent ice down my spine. Ryan must have sensed the shift in my expression because his face darkened. "What is it?" I swallowed hard. "We should go back." We turned around, retracing our steps through the snow. The restaurant was only a few blocks away, but with every step, the air grew colder. The streetlights flickered. The wind howled through the empty alleys, carrying whispers that seemed to weave in and out of my thoughts just beyond comprehension. Then Ryan stopped, his shoulders tensed, his breath sharp. I followed his gaze, and saw the handprint again. This time, it was on his shoulder, higher, closer, like something was climbing up his back. I grabbed his arm. "Run!" We sprinted down the street, our feet crunching against the snow. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it, the presence behind us, close enough that my skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. My lungs burned, my pulse erratic. We reached the restaurant, the warm glow of its windows a cruel contrast to the cold consuming us. As soon as we stepped inside, the feeling snapped away, like it had never been there. The warmth of the room pressed against my frozen skin. The distant hum of other diners talking, the clinking of glasses, it all felt too normal, too detached from what had just happened. Ryan was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled off his coat. I stared at his back. The handprint was gone. Neither of us spoke about it. Not at first. We sat at a table, ordering something warm just to steady ourselves. The silence between us was thick, heavy, with something unspoken. Then Ryan finally broke it. "That wasn't just the cold, was it?" His voice was quiet, careful. I shook my head. A deep breath. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. "I felt it," he admitted after a long pause. "I didn't want to say anything, but it felt like something was pressing against me." A shiver ran through me. "Like what?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He hesitated. "Like fingers." I didn't respond. I couldn't. We left the restaurant together, walking quickly toward our cars. The snowfall had thickened, covering our footprints from before. I pulled my coat tighter around me, my nerves still raw.
The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting elongated shadows across the snow. As we reached Ryan's car, he paused. Then his face drained of color. I followed his gaze. My stomach twisted violently. On the frozen windshield, clear as day, was a handprint, but this time it wasn't alone. There were more, dozens covering the glass, the hood, the roof, some overlapping, some fresh, as if something had been crawling over the car. Ryan backed away, shaking his head. No, this isn't... The wind howled, and in it I heard something unmistakable. A laugh, software distant, but impossibly close. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wait. I turned, running for my own car, my pulse a frantic drum in my ears. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut, locking it. I forced my breathing to slow. I needed to think. I needed to tap. The sound was so light, so faint, that for a moment I thought I had imagined it. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I turned my head slowly toward the passenger window. A handprint was forming, right before my eyes. The fingers pressed against the glass from the inside. I screamed.
Story number 4. The red scarf. I should have paid attention to the way she held her scarf, the way her fingers tightened around it, like she was afraid to let go. It was snowing heavily that night, the streets blanketed in white, the air sharp and cold. I had arrived early at the little cafe where we planned to meet, a quiet place with dim lights and the rich smell of coffee lingering in the air. I found a table by the window, watching the snow fall in slow, heavy flakes. Then she walked in. She was beautiful, in an old-fashioned way, pale skin, dark hair, lips painted a deep shade of red. But the thing I noticed most was the scarf wrapped around her neck, a thick, knitted red scarf that seemed almost too tight. It clashed against the rest of her muted winter clothing, standing out like a warning sign. "Sorry I'm late," she said softly, slipping into the chair across from me. The snow made it hard to get a cab. Her voice was calm, almost distant. There was something about her that felt off, not in an obvious way, just a subtle unease that settled in my chest. Maybe it was the way her eyes flickered to the window too often, as if expecting to see someone watching, or the way she kept adjusting the scarf, pulling it higher as though the warmth wasn't enough. We started talking, the usual first date conversation. She was polite, well-spoken, but there was an odd rhythm to the way she spoke, like she was forcing herself to be present. I tried to ignore it. Maybe she was just nervous. Then, halfway through our coffee, she asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" I blinked. The question came out of nowhere, breaking the casual flow of conversation. I gave a hesitant chuckle. "I guess I'm open to the idea. Why?" She tilted her head slightly. "Because there's something following me." The way she said it, so calm, so certain, sent a chill up my spine. I studied her face, expecting to see amusement. I hoped that she was joking, but her expression was blank, unreadable. "Following you," I echoed, my voice quieter now. She nodded, fingers tightening around the scarf again. "It started a few weeks ago. At first it was just a feeling. You know that sense that someone's behind you when you're walking alone? I ignored it. Thought I was being paranoid." She exhaled, eyes flickering to the cafe's entrance before continuing. "Then I started seeing it. A shadow, always at a distance, never moving, just watching, nodding around. It was there." I swallowed. "Did you tell anyone?" Her lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. No one believes these things until it's too late. The air around us felt heavier now. The warmth of the cafe seemed weaker, like the cold from outside had somehow slipped in. I forced a small laugh. "Maybe it's just—" She cut me off. "You think I'm crazy." I hesitated. "I didn't say that. You don't have to." She leaned in slightly, her fingers still gripping that red scarf, like it was the only thing keeping her together. "It's here, you know." My breath hitched. "Here." She nodded slowly.
outside. Against my better judgment, I turned my head toward the window. The snowfall blurred the street beyond, but through the hazy white I could make out the figures of people walking, bundled up against the cold. Nothing strange, nothing unusual. Then my eyes landed on something standing completely still. Not a person. Not exactly. It stood just beyond the glow of the streetlights, half hidden in the swirling snow. A tall, thin silhouette, too rigid, too motionless. My stomach twisted. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe a lamppost, maybe a trick of the light, but I felt its presence. I turned back to her. What is it? Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee, but she didn't take a sip. I don't know, she admitted, but it wants me to take this off. She tugged lightly at the scarf, but didn't loosen it. I finally noticed what had been nagging at me all night. The edges of the fabric weren't tucked in. There was no end, no beginning, just a continuous wrap around her neck, seamless and unbroken. I stared at her. Why don't you? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because I know what happens if I do. A gust of wind rattled the cafe windows. For the first time since we sat down, she looked directly into my eyes. There was something in her gaze, a quiet, exhausted kind of fear. I made a mistake, she whispered. A few weeks ago, I turned around. I saw its face. The lights in the cafe flickered. A couple at the far end of the room glanced up but went back to their conversation. No one else seemed to feel the suffocating tension curling around us. She swallowed hard. That night, I woke up gasping for air. Something was pulling at my throat. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its fingers digging into my skin, crushing me. I noticed then, just barely visible beneath the edge of the scarf, dark, bruised skin. I don't know why it let go, she murmured. But when I woke up, this was around my neck. She touched the scarf gently, almost reverently. And I knew. If I ever took it off, it wouldn't stop next time. A sharp gust of wind howled outside. I glanced at the window again. The thing was still there, closer now. The overhead light above us flickered violently, buzzing like an angry insect. She let out a slow, shaky breath. It's coming inside. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. No one in the cafe reacted. My pulse hammered against my ribs. We need to go. She didn't move. Her fingers, still curled around the scarf, were trembling now. It's too late, she whispered. The cafe door creaked open. The air changed instantly. The warm scent of coffee vanished, replaced by something old and damp, like rotting fabric left in the snow too long. The chatter around us didn't stop, but it felt muted, distant, like we had slipped into a space between reality and something else entirely. I didn't dare turn around. I felt it behind me, tall, still, watching. Then I heard the sound I will never forget, the slow, deliberate unraveling of fabric. I turned back to her. Her hands had gone limp. The red scarf was loosening, unwinding itself in smooth, steady movements, as if being pulled by invisible hands. Her expression was eerily calm. Her lips parted slightly, and in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "I can finally breathe again." The scarf slid from her neck, and her head fell to the table.
Story number 4. The red scarf. I should have paid attention to the way she held her scarf, the way her fingers tightened around it, like she was afraid to let go. It was snowing heavily that night, the streets blanketed in white, the air sharp and cold. I had arrived early at the little cafe where we planned to meet, a quiet place with dim lights and the rich smell of coffee lingering in the air. I found a table by the window, watching the snow fall in slow, heavy flakes. Then she walked in. She was beautiful, in an old-fashioned way, pale skin, dark hair, lips painted a deep shade of red. But the thing I noticed most was the scarf wrapped around her neck, a thick, knitted red scarf that seemed almost too tight. It clashed against the rest of her muted winter clothing, standing out like a warning sign. "Sorry I'm late," she said softly, slipping into the chair across from me. The snow made it hard to get a cab. Her voice was calm, almost distant. There was something about her that felt
off. Not in an obvious way, just a subtle unease that settled in my chest. Maybe it was the way her eyes flickered to the window too often, as if expecting to see someone watching, or the way she kept adjusting the scarf, pulling it higher as though the warmth wasn't enough. We started talking, the usual first date conversation. She was polite, well-spoken, but there was an odd rhythm to the way she spoke, like she was forcing herself to be present. I tried to ignore it. Maybe she was just nervous. Then, halfway through our coffee, she asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" I blinked. The question came out of nowhere, breaking the casual flow of conversation. I gave a hesitant chuckle. "I guess I'm open to the idea. Why?" She tilted her head slightly. "Because there's something following me?" The way she said it, so calm, so certain, sent a chill up my spine. I studied her face, expecting to see amusement. I thought that she was joking, but her expression was blank, unreadable. "Following you," I echoed, my voice quieter now. She nodded, fingers tightening around the scarf again. "It started a few weeks ago. At first it was just a feeling. You know that sense that someone's behind you when you're walking alone? I ignored it. Thought I was being paranoid." She exhaled, eyes flickering to the cafe's entrance before continuing. "Then I started seeing a shadow, always at a distance, never moving, just watching. Whatever I went, it was there."
I swallowed hard. If someone had been in here, they were still inside. I told myself I was being paranoid. That if there was really someone here, I would have seen signs, an open door, footprints in the snow. But the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. I climbed the stairs slowly, every creak of the wood beneath my feet echoing through the house. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the doorknob. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. No sign of movement. No sign that anyone had been here. Everything was exactly how I had left it, and yet the cold lingered, a biting chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. I stepped inside hesitantly, my breath shallow. The curtains were drawn, the window locked. I exhaled, relief creeping in. Maybe it really had been my imagination. The snow, the exhaustion. I had convinced myself I saw something that wasn't there. I turned to leave. Then I saw it. A single wet footprint on the wooden floor. My stomach twisted violently. The footprint was faint, just one, half faded against the floorboards. But it was there, clear as day. And it wasn't mine. I backed away, my pulse hammering. The air felt wrong, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, from somewhere inside the house, I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak. The sound of someone stepping forward. I spun around, my eyes darting to the hallway. Nothing. Just shadows stretching long and deep. My own breathing was the only sound in the suffocating silence. I forced myself to move, my feet unsteady as I backed toward my bedroom door. My hands fumbled for the light switch, flipping it off. If something was in here, I didn't want it to see me. I inched toward the staircase, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. Another creak, closer this time. I swallowed a sob. My fingers wrapped around my phone, shaky hands dialing Eric's number. My heart pounded as I waited for him to pick up. The ringing seemed to stretch on forever. Then, finally, "Hello?" I exhaled sharply, my voice barely above a whisper. "Eric, there's someone in my house." Silence. Then his voice, confused. "What? I just dropped you off." "I know, but Something moved at the bottom of the stairs. I clamped a hand over my mouth, biting back a scream. A shadow, long and unnaturally still, stretched across the floor. Someone was standing just out of view, watching, waiting. I forced myself to move. I bolted for the nearest room, the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My breaths came fast and ragged, my body pressed against the door. "Claire." Eric's voice came through the phone, sharp with worry. My fingers shook as I pressed the phone to my ear. "He's inside," I choked out. "I saw him in the window. He was inside the whole time." Eric cursed. "I'm coming back. Lock the doors. Call the police." My throat tightened.
My gaze flickered to the crack under the door, and I saw it. A pair of bare feet, standing just outside the door. I sucked in a breath, my entire body paralyzed. My pulse pounded in my skull. The feet didn't move, just stood there, waiting. Then, in the silence, I heard it. A whisper. Low, raspy, so close. "I've been waiting for you to come home." The bathroom light flickered. The air turned frigid. And then, the doorknob started to turn.
Story number 6. The diner that doesn't exist. I should have known something was wrong the moment we stepped inside. The warmth felt fake, like a blanket thrown over something cold and lifeless. It had been snowing for hours, the kind of relentless winter storm that turned roads into death traps. My date, Adam, had been driving us back from a Valentine's Day getaway when the storm thickened. The highway disappeared under an endless white sheet, and soon we were crawling through the dark, our headlights barely cutting through the swirling snow. That's when we saw it. A small diner, glowing warmly in the middle of nowhere. A neon sign buzzed faintly above the entrance. Molly's Diner. The parking lot was empty, but the open sign flickered invitingly in the window. "Thank God," Adam muttered, pulling in. "I need a break from this storm." I nodded, though something about the place unsettled me. Maybe it was how suddenly it appeared through the snow, like it had been waiting for us. But my stomach was empty, my fingers numb from the cold, so I pushed the unease aside and followed him in. The inside was exactly what you'd expect from an old roadside diner. Vinyl booths, checkered floor, the faint hum of an old jukebox playing some forgotten tune. A smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. It should have felt comforting, but it didn't. Something was off. The lighting was dim, casting strange shadows. The air felt thick, like it had weight, and despite the storm outside, the diner was warm. Too warm. The kind of heat that felt smothering, making my skin prickle. A woman stood behind the counter, wiping a glass with slow, deliberate movements. Her uniform was old-fashioned, a pale pink dress with a little white apron. She looked up as we entered, her eyes oddly unreadable. "Welcome to Molly's," she said, her voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "Take a seat anywhere you like." Adam and I exchanged a glance before sliding into the nearest booth. The menus were already on the table. No prices, just a list of classic diner foods. Burgers, fries, milkshakes. My stomach twisted slightly, but I ignored it. The waitress appeared beside us without a sound. I hadn't even seen her move. "What can I get you?" Adam ordered a burger and coffee. I hesitated before settling on a grilled cheese and tea. The waitress smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She scribbled the order down and walked away without a sound. The jukebox crackled. The song changed. Something slow. Something wrong. I glanced around. The diner was empty, yet it felt like we weren't alone. The air carried an odd hum, like the space itself was breathing. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. "Something feels weird," I murmured. Adam raised an eyebrow. "It's just an old diner." I frowned. "Exactly. It looks too old, like it's stuck in time." He rolled his eyes. "You're overthinking it." Maybe I was. Maybe the storm was just messing with my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here. Then the food arrived. The waitress set down our plates with the same too-perfect smile. The grilled cheese looked normal. The tea, too. But Adam's burger. The patty was gray. Not raw, not burnt, just gray. I stared. "Adam, don't eat that." He laughed. "It's just the lighting." He took a bite, chewed, paused, then swallowed with an odd expression. "Tastes weird." He took another bite, slower this time. "Like dust?" My stomach twisted violently. The waitress was still standing there, still smiling. "Everything okay?" she asked. Adam hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just different." The waitress tilted her head slightly. "We make things how they used to taste." A cold wave of nausea rolled through me. "Used to?" I echoed. She didn't answer, just walked away without a sound. The air felt thicker, the hum grew louder. The song on the jukebox warped, slowing down, the notes stretching in unnatural ways. "Adam, we need to go." My voice was barely a whisper. He sighed. "We just got here." I leaned forward. "Something is wrong." The hum deepened. I could feel it pressing against my skin. And then I saw it. The counter. The floor. The walls. Peeling. The perfect, polished diner exterior was fading, crumbling away like old wallpaper. Beneath it, the true diner was rotting, wood darkened with moisture, floors warped and broken. The neon glow dimmed, flickering weakly, revealing something ruined beneath the illusion. The waitress stood behind the counter, watching us. Only she wasn't right anymore. Her eyes were gone. Empty sockets stared at me, her too wide smile stretching unnaturally. The edges of her dress were frayed, her hands no longer smooth but withered and gray. I grabbed Adam's wrist. "We need to leave. Now." The hum turned into a whisper. 100 voices murmuring beneath my skin. Adam finally saw. He shot to his feet, knocking his plate to the ground. The waitress didn't move, just smiled wider. "We should go," he said, voice shaking. We turned for the door. The diners were suddenly there. They filled the booths, the counters, the stools. Their backs were hunched, faces blurred and featureless. Their hands twitched, their heads jerked at unnatural angles, and they were all staring at us. The whispers turned into screams. I grabbed Adam's arm, yanking him toward the door. It felt farther than before, the walls stretching, the air thickening. My chest burned, my pulse a frantic drumbeat. We slammed into the door, shoving it open, and stumbled into the freezing night. The whispers cut off instantly. The air was painfully cold, the snow falling in heavy silence. My breath came out in ragged gasps. I turned, expecting to see the diner's glowing sign, the warm light spilling from its windows. But there was nothing, just a crumbling ruin, a building long abandoned, its roof half caved in, windows shattered. No neon sign, no warmth, just rot and decay half buried in the snow. Adam's voice was barely a breath. "What the hell?" My hands were shaking. I stepped forward, peering through the broken door. Inside, the booths were torn, stuffing spilling out. The floors were warped with mold. The counter was covered in dust and cobwebs, and at the far end, the waitress stood, not moving, not smiling, just watching. I grabbed Adam's hand and ran. We didn't stop until we reached the car, our breath fogging up the windows as we sped down the icy road. My heart slammed against my ribs, my skin crawling with the memory of that rotting diner, those empty eyes. Adam didn't speak for a long time, then finally he whispered, "Did we just eat there?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to, because I could still taste the dust on my tongue.
Story number 7. The Silent Date. I should have left the moment I realized she wasn't speaking, but by then it was too late. The night started like any other first date. A snowy Valentine's evening at an upscale winter resort, the kind of place where everything felt too perfect. Dim lighting, elegant decor, soft music playing just below the sound of clinking glasses. I had matched with her online a few weeks ago, and though our conversations had been short, they were intriguing. She had this way of answering questions without actually saying much. I figured she was just the quiet type. When she arrived, she was exactly like her pictures, maybe even more beautiful in person. Long black hair, porcelain skin, sharp blue eyes that seemed to see through me. She smiled as she slid into the chair across from me, her red dress standing out against the wintry backdrop outside the window. "Nice to finally meet you," I said, adjusting my napkin. She smiled again, tilting her head slightly, but she didn't say a word. I waited, expecting some kind of greeting, maybe a nervous laugh, but she just watched me. I cleared my throat. "How was the drive?" Nothing, just that soft, unreadable smile. Maybe she was shy, maybe she had social anxiety. I told myself not to overthink it. She had agreed to this date after all. I tried again. "This place is really nice, huh?" She nodded, but still not a single word. The waiter arrived, and I felt relieved to break the heavy silence. He greeted us warmly,
listing off the specials. "Can I start you both with some wine?" Before I could answer, my date held up 2 fingers. The waiter nodded, unfazed, and walked away. That's when my stomach twisted. Something about the way she moved, so fluid, so rehearsed, sent a shiver down my spine. I forced a chuckle. "You're not much of a talker, huh?" She didn't react, just smiled. The unease crept up my throat. I glanced around the restaurant, searching for something to ground me. But suddenly, everything felt off. The light seemed too dim, the air too still. I could hear the faint clinking of silverware, but the sounds felt wrong, distorted. The waiter returned with our drinks, setting them down gently. "Would you like to order?" he asked. I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, she raised her hand again, pointing at something on the menu. The waiter nodded immediately and scribbled it down. No confirmation, no repeating the order. Just acceptance. I watched in frozen confusion as she slowly turned her gaze back to me, her fingers lightly tapping against the rim of her glass. A deep, creeping wrongness slithered into my gut. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low. "Is this some kind of joke?" She blinked, tilted her head, but she still didn't speak. The air felt heavier, the room smaller. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had a speech condition. Maybe she was mute and hadn't told me. But then why had she spoken to me online? I swallowed hard. "Why aren't you talking?" She stared at me, fingers still tapping against her glass. Then, finally, she moved. She leaned forward, her mouth opened slightly, her lips parting. And then, nothing. No sound, no whisper. Nothing came out. I felt a cold wave of nausea. Her mouth was open, wider now, but it was like something was missing, like the air itself refused to carry her voice. My blood ran cold. My hands trembled beneath the table. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to get up, get out, get away from her. But I couldn't move. Something in her expression trapped me. Then she reached out. Her fingers brushed against my wrist, ice cold, unnaturally cold. And in that moment the entire restaurant shifted. The background flickered. The waiters, the guests, they blurred. Their movements became jerky, unnatural, like old film skipping frames. The whispers started, not from her, not from the other guests, from everywhere. Soft, murmuring voices layered over each other, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The candle on the table flickered violently, the shadows around us stretching, twisting. I looked around in panic, and then I saw it, the mirrors. There were 3 of them on the far wall, reflecting the entire dining room. But something was wrong with our reflection. In the glass, my date was still sitting perfectly still, except she wasn't facing me anymore. Her head was turned completely around, her body frozen in place, her mouth still slightly open. But in the mirror, she was smiling directly at me. I shoved back my chair. The whispering grew louder, the candle snapped out, plunging the table into shadow. I turned to run, but the restaurant was empty. No guests, no waiters, nothing but rows of abandoned tables, untouched meals, and silence. I spun back around. My date was still sitting there, still smiling. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What are you?" She just watched me, waiting. The whispering was inside my head now, crawling under my skin. Then she stood up, and for the first time, she spoke. A single word, not in a whisper, not in a scream, but in a voice that was identical to mine. "Stay." The room collapsed. The air rushed out of my lungs, my vision blurred, and for a brief, horrifying second, I felt my entire body being dragged into the silence. And then, I was outside, standing in the snow, the restaurant behind me glowing warmly like nothing had happened. The street was empty, the air still. My footprints were the only ones in the snow. I turned, my heart hammering. Through the restaurant window, I saw the table where we had sat. The candle was still burning,
But the seat across from mine was empty. She was gone. The whispers were gone. I stumbled back to my car, barely able to breathe. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. I opened my messages, scrolled to our chat, and my stomach dropped. There was nothing. No messages, no profile, no sign that she had ever existed. Just an empty conversation thread, and one unread message from me. A single word. Stay.
Story number 8. Footsteps in the snow. I should have never looked back. If I hadn't, I could have convinced myself it was just my imagination. It had started as a perfect first date. A quiet Valentine's dinner at a small candlelit restaurant, the kind that felt intimate even with other people around. The snow outside was thick, untouched except for the trails left by passing cars. My date, Daniel, had been charming. The kind of guy who made conversation easy. By the time we left the restaurant, the snowfall had settled into a slow, steady drift, coating the streets in fresh white. "Let's walk," he suggested. "It's too beautiful to waste in a car ride." I agreed. There was something almost magical about the night. The soft glow of streetlights against the snow, the quiet hush that blanketed everything. We walked side by side, our footsteps the only sound in the stillness. The air was crisp, cold enough to sting, but not unbearable. At some point, Daniel stopped to check his phone, so I took out mine and snapped a quick picture of the snow-covered sidewalk ahead of us. The street was empty, peaceful, just us and the winter silence. Or so I thought. I glanced down at the photo. My heart stopped. There were 3 sets of footprints in the snow. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. The street behind us was empty. The only prints in the snow were ours, 2 sets leading from the restaurant, perfectly parallel. But in the picture, clear as day, there was a 3rd trail, slightly behind us, between us. I felt a rush of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Daniel noticed my expression. "You okay?" I forced a smile, my voice shaky. "Yeah. Just thought I saw something weird." I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe it had been a glitch in my phone camera. Maybe I had imagined it, but I knew what I saw. We kept walking, but now my skin crawled with an unease I couldn't shake. Every few steps I stole glances behind us. Nothing. Then I started listening. Our footsteps were steady, rhythmic. 2 pairs of boots crunching against the snow in perfect sync. Crunch, crunch, crunch. But after a few moments something changed. Crunch, 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 crunch. A half step behind us, lighter, like someone walking barefoot on the frozen ground. I froze. Daniel took a few more steps before realizing I had stopped. He turned, his brow furrowing. "Hey, what's—" "Shh." My pulse pounded. "Listen." For a moment, nothing. Just the distant hum of the wind. Then, crunch right behind me. I spun around. No one was there. The street stretched out, empty and quiet, the fresh snow undisturbed except for our own tracks. My throat tightened. I knew it wasn't possible, but I felt it. A presence. Something unseen, moving just out of reach. Daniel frowned. "What's going on?" I hesitated, then finally showed him my phone. "I took this picture a minute ago." He glanced at it, then back at the ground. Confusion flickered across his face. "That's weird." He shook his head. Maybe someone walked ahead of us earlier and the snow covered their prints. I stared at him. Then why aren't they still there now? His expression changed. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the empty street. The same realization dawned on him. There were only 2 sets of prints. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The temperature seemed to plummet, an unnatural cold settling into my bones. "Let's go," I whispered. We started walking again, faster this time. Neither of us spoke. My breath came in quick, foggy bursts. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to look back. But the sound followed. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I clenched my fists. "Daniel, you hear that, right?" He didn't answer, just nodded once. His jaw was tight. The steps behind us sped up. I ran. Daniel caught my wrist and yanked me forward. We sprinted down the street, our feet kicking up snow. The houses and buildings blurred past us, the streetlights flickering, but the footsteps kept pace. Right behind us, chasing. I could feel it now, something breathing against the back of my neck, cold and suffocating. The presence loomed, unseen but undeniable. We reached Daniel's car, skidding to a stop as he fumbled for his keys. My pulse hammered against my skull. The footsteps stopped. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel it standing there, watching, waiting. Daniel yanked the door open and we both tumbled inside, slamming the door shut. He locked them immediately, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Silence. For a long moment we just sat there panting. The windshield was already fogging up from our breathing. Then, without thinking, I reached for my phone and snapped a picture through the car window. The flash illuminated the snow-covered street. I wished I hadn't done that. The photo was clear, sharp, undeniable. A figure stood outside my window. Tall, too tall, skin pale as the snow, face obscured in the shadow of the streetlights. Its body was wrong, like it had been stretched just a little too far. But it was the footprints that made my stomach turn. There weren't just 3 sets anymore. There were 4. I dropped my phone. Drive. Now. Daniel didn't hesitate. The tires skidded against the ice as we pulled away, the streetlights blurring past. I refused to look back. The drive was silent. Neither of us spoke. The farther we got from that street, the warmer the air inside the car felt. The tension eased, but only slightly. Finally, Daniel let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. What the hell was that? I shook my head. I don't know. I picked up my phone with trembling hands, my thumb hovering over the last photo. Part of me wanted to delete it without looking, but I had to know. I opened the picture. The figure was closer now, no longer standing in the street. It was pressing against the glass. Its hands, long and skeletal, were pressed flat against the car window. But the worst part? The snow outside was untouched. No footprints leading up to the car. Like it had never walked there. Like it had been with us the whole time.
Story number 9. The stranger in the cabin. I should have listened to my instincts. The moment I stepped inside that cabin, something felt wrong. It had been a spontaneous idea, a cozy Valentine's getaway, just the 2 of us, away from the noise of the city. Daniel had booked a secluded cabin deep in the woods, promising it was the perfect place to relax. The snow had been falling heavily the entire drive up, covering the world in a thick, untouched white. By the time we arrived, the sky was a deep, endless black, the trees swaying in the bitter wind. The cabin was small but charming, just as advertised. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a large window that looked out onto the snow-covered forest. The kind of place where time felt slower, where the silence stretched too far. The owner had left the key under the mat, just as they said they would. No one else was around. Or at least we should have been. The moment I stepped inside, my stomach twisted. The air inside was wrong, thick, unmoving, too cold, like the walls themselves were holding on to something they shouldn't. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the winter air, the lack of central heating. Daniel set our bags down and stretched. Not bad, huh? I forced a smile. Yeah, it's nice. But something wasn't. The first sign came when I went to unpack. I opened the bedroom door and stopped cold. The bed was made, the room tidy, except for one thing, a chair. It was pulled up close to the bed, facing it, like someone had been sitting there, watching. I frowned. Daniel, did you move this? He poked his head in, shaking his head. Number Y. I hesitated, staring at the chair. Something about the way it sat felt deliberate, like someone had been there recently. But the cabin was empty when we arrived, wasn't it? I tried to shake the thought. No reason. We spent the evening trying to settle in. Daniel lit a fire, and we sat by the flickering glow, sipping wine. It should have felt perfect, romantic. But the unease never left me. I kept glancing toward the hallway, toward the dark bedroom, toward the chair, and then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. A creak. From above us.
I froze. Daniel must have heard it too, because he tensed beside me. We looked at each other, the fire crackling between us. "There's nothing up there, right?" I whispered. He frowned. "There's no second floor." We sat in silence, listening. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. But inside, it was dead quiet, until we heard it again. A slow, deliberate step from the attic. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't want to say it, didn't even want to think it. But there was only one explanation. Someone was up there. Daniel stood, his face pale. "I'll check it out." I grabbed his wrist. "Are you crazy?" He hesitated, then nodded. "We can't just ignore it." I swallowed hard. He was right. The thought of sleeping in a cabin with something moving above us made my skin crawl. We had to know. We grabbed the flashlight from our bag and slowly made our way to the attic hatch in the ceiling. A thin rope dangled down, the kind you pull to unfold the ladder. I stared at it. I had a terrible feeling. Daniel grabbed the rope. The ladder creaked as it lowered, revealing a dark opening above. The air that poured down was freezing. He lifted the flashlight and pointed it up. The beam swept across the attic. Dust floated in the stale air. Wooden beams, empty shelves, and then a footprint in the dust. Fresh. I sucked in a sharp breath. Someone had been up there. Daniel's grip on the flashlight tightened. "Hello?" Silence. Then a scraping sound. Something moved. Daniel yanked the ladder back up and slammed the hatch shut. "We're leaving, now." My heart was pounding. We grabbed our jackets, our bags, anything we could carry, and rushed toward the door. Daniel twisted the knob. It didn't move. He cursed under his breath, rattling it harder. "It's locked." My blood ran cold. "You locked it when we came in, right?" His face paled. "Number I didn't. Something locked us in." A slow creak echoed from the hallway. The bedroom door was open. The chair was facing the doorway now. My throat tightened. "Daniel, someone's in here." The air felt wrong. The fire behind us dimmed, flickering low. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor. And then the attic hatch slammed open. I didn't look. I didn't want to see what was up there. Daniel grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it like a weapon. "Whoever you are, get the hell out!" No answer. Just the sound of something shifting. Then footsteps, coming down. We ran. Daniel threw his weight against the door, forcing it open. The cold night air hit us like a punch, the snow swirling in heavy gusts. We didn't stop. We ran through the thick snow, slipping, stumbling, barely able to breathe. Somewhere behind us, the cabin door slammed shut. We made it to the car, Daniel fumbling with the keys, hands shaking. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the dark. And that's when I saw it, through the cabin window. A figure, tall, too tall, standing just behind the glass, watching. Its face was wrong, stretched, grinning. I grabbed Daniel's arm. "Drive. Now." The tires skidded against the ice as we sped away, the cabin shrinking in the rearview mirror. My breath came in short gasps, my chest tight. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The only sound was the wind, the hum of the tires against the frozen road. Finally, Daniel whispered, "There wasn't supposed to be an attic." My blood turned to ice. I turned to him slowly. "What?" He gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. I checked the listing. The cabin is one story, no attic, no second floor. A wave of nausea hit me. "But we—" Daniel's hands trembled. That wasn't the attic, that was something else. The realization sat heavy between us. Whatever was in that cabin, it wasn't human. I reached for my phone, needing to call someone, anyone, just to hear a familiar voice. My fingers hovered over the screen. Then I noticed something, a notification, one I didn't remember getting, a photo, from an unknown number. My throat closed up as I opened it. It was blurry, taken in the dark, but I recognized it immediately. It was us running through the snow, taken from inside the cabin. Story number 10. The cemetery date. I should have never agreed to meet him there. It was Valentine's night and the snow had been falling for hours, thick and quiet. The streets were nearly empty, coated in white, muffling the usual city sounds. When Liam suggested something different for our first date, I'd expected a quiet cafe, maybe a walk under the twinkling streetlights. Not a cemetery. "I promise it's not as creepy as it sounds," he had laughed over the phone. "It's actually peaceful. The view from the hill is incredible at night." Something about his voice had made it hard to say no. There was a confidence to it, a charm that made the whole thing seem less strange than it really was. So I said yes. Now, standing at the cemetery gates, I felt that first prick of unease. The iron bars were cold beneath my fingers as I pushed them open, the hinges letting out a low groan. Snow covered the ground, untouched except for a single set of footprints leading inside. His. I followed them. The graves stretched out in endless rows, their headstones barely visible beneath the thick snow. The air was impossibly still, the only sound my boots crunching against the frozen ground. I pulled my coat tighter around me, my breath curling in soft white clouds. "Liam?" My voice felt too loud in the quiet. Nothing. I walked further, following his footprints. They led up a small hill, just as he had said, to a lone bench beneath an old twisted tree. And there he was, standing near the edge, looking out over the city lights below. "You actually came?" he said without turning around. I let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, well, I figured if you were a serial killer, you'd pick somewhere less obvious." He finally turned, grinning. Fair point. His dark hair was dusted with snow, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. He looked at ease, like standing in a cemetery in the dead of winter was the most natural thing in the world. "You like it?" he asked. I hesitated, glancing around. "It's eerie." He nodded, then gestured to the bench. "Come sit." I did. The wood was freezing beneath me, even through my coat. Liam sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just watched the city lights shimmer in the distance, the quiet wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. Then Liam exhaled softly. "You know," he said, "they say cemeteries aren't really empty." I turned to him. "What do you mean?" He smiled slightly. "The dead don't just stay in one place, they wander." A cold wave prickled at my skin. I tried to laugh. "Okay, now you're just trying to scare me." He tilted his head. "Am I?" The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the bare branches above us. The snow seemed to whisper as it moved. I swallowed. "Have you ever seen anything?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on something in the distance, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Do you know how you died?" I blinked. "What?" He finally turned to face me, his eyes darker than before. "Do you remember?" A sharp, icy feeling twisted in my gut. "Liam, that's not funny. I'm not joking." His voice was softer now, careful. My hands curled into fists. "Why would you ask me that?" "Because," he murmured, "you don't belong here." The cold deepened, seeping through my skin, into my bones. I looked down at my hands, at the way the snow clung to my coat. And then I noticed. There were no footprints behind me. I had followed his into the cemetery, but mine weren't there. My breath hitched. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not—" A gust of wind blew past, carrying a distant echo of laughter. I turned sharply, scanning the graves below. The headstones looked different now, more defined, their names clearer in the dim light. Then I saw it. My name, carved into stone. The date beneath it was tonight. A choked sound escaped my throat. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my chest tightening, my vision blurred, my pulse hammering in my ears. Liam stood slowly. His expression wasn't cruel or mocking. It was sad. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I shook my head violently. No, this isn't real. I drove here. I walked." But the memories came rushing in like ice water flooding my lungs. The drive, the snow, the way the road had blurred in front of me, the headlights, the impact.
A sob tore through me. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to feel something, anything that would ground me. But the cold was endless now, stretching inside me, a hollow emptiness I couldn't escape.
Liam stepped closer. "You were in an accident," he said gently. "You never made it here." I squeezed my eyes shut. "Number, please, His voice softened even more. "I come here every year. You were supposed to meet me that night, but you never arrived. I waited. I always waited." Tears blurred my vision. "Liam, please." Then I remembered. His voice on the phone, the easy laughter, the warmth. But Liam had died 2 years ago. I had read the news. A car crash, late at night. A cemetery visit gone wrong. I knew that, and yet I had still come here. I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting his eyes. For the first time, I noticed the way his breath didn't fog in the cold air, the way the wind didn't touch him. He smiled softly. "I didn't want you to be alone." A sharp crack split the air. The ground beneath me shifted. A deep pull dragged at my chest, pulling me back into the dark, into the cold. "Liam!" I reached for him, but my fingers passed through his. His lips parted, and then I was falling. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my car. The snow was still falling. The world outside blurred and endless. My hands were gripping the wheel, my breath fogging the windshield. Headlights beamed through the storm, then a blaring horn. Impact. Darkness. And then silence. I don't know how long I drifted. But the next time I opened my eyes, I was standing at the cemetery gates. The footprints were already there, waiting for me. Story number 11. The candlelit table. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the restaurant was. Too quiet. It was Valentine's night, and my date, Alex, had planned something special. An upscale, candlelit dinner at a secluded restaurant just outside town. It wasn't listed online, and when I asked how he had found it, he just smiled and said, "A friend recommended it. It's exclusive." The drive there was eerie. The snow-covered roads stretched endlessly, the headlights barely cutting through the thick fog. The restaurant appeared out of nowhere, nestled between towering trees. It was a grand, old building, its windows glowing with soft, flickering light. The neon sign above the entrance simply read, "Dinner." Inside it was beautiful. Ornate chandeliers, deep red curtains, tables draped in velvet cloths. A candle burned at the center of each table, its flame swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. The air smelled faintly of roses and something else, something older. There were no other guests. I hesitated in the doorway. "Are we early?" Alex frowned, glancing around. "I don't think so." The waiter appeared before I even saw him coming. His face was long, pale, his eyes dark and too still. He wore an old-fashioned black suit, buttoned up to his throat. "Your table is ready," he said, his voice low and hollow. He led us to a perfectly set table, isolated near the back of the room. The candlelight flickered unnaturally, stretching shadows across the walls. I sat down, my unease growing. "Where is everyone?" I asked quietly. Alex shrugged. "Maybe we got lucky. Private dinner." It didn't feel like luck. The waiter handed us menus. There were no prices, just a list of dishes written in elegant, faded script. The paper was old, edges yellowed, as if it had been handled for years. Alex didn't seem to notice. "I'll have the steak," he said. The waiter turned to me. His stare was heavy, as if he was waiting for me to say the right thing. I cleared my throat. The pasta, I guess." The waiter's lips curled into a thin smile. "Excellent choice." He left without writing anything down. I leaned in toward Alex. "I don't like this place." He chuckled. "Come on, it's nice. Romantic." I looked around again. The silence was suffocating. There was no kitchen noise, no clinking of plates or distant laughter, just us, the flickering candlelight and the faint ticking of an unseen clock. Then something changed. The room felt bigger. The tables, once empty, now had shapes sitting at them. I blinked. The figures were blurry, out of focus, like they were just on the edge of reality. Shadows where people should be. I grabbed Alex's hand. "Do you see that?" He frowned. "See what?" The shadows shifted. One of them turned its head toward me. I sucked in a sharp breath. "Alex, we need to go." The waiter reappeared without a sound, placing our plates down with slow, deliberate movements. The steak was raw, gray, the fat marbled in ways that didn't look right. My pasta was wrong. The noodles curled and twisted like something had been growing in them. The candlelight flickered violently. The room warped. "We should eat before it gets cold," the waiter said, still smiling. My hands trembled. "I'm not hungry." The waiter didn't react. "Then why did you come here?" The whispering started. Low, distant voices layered over each other, too many to count. The shadows at the other tables twitched, their blurred figures jerking unnaturally. Alex's face had gone pale. He finally noticed. "What the hell?" The waiter's grin widened, too wide. "Eat." The whispers grew louder. The figures stood up. I grabbed Alex's hand, yanking him to his feet. "We need to leave now." The waiter blocked our way. His expression was blank now, his eyes voids. "You haven't finished your meal." The shadows closed in, their figures becoming clearer, their faces stretching, eyes hollow and mouths hanging open in frozen screams. I ran. Alex stumbled after me, knocking over the candle as we pushed past the waiter. The flame didn't go out. Instead, it grew, twisting upward like a reaching hand. The restaurant shook. The walls melted into darkness. We crashed through the front door into the freezing night. The air was sharp and real, the snow beneath my feet a harsh contrast to the suffocating unreality inside. The restaurant was gone. We stood on the side of an empty road. No grand building, no neon sign. Just an abandoned lot, covered in snow. Alex gasped for breath beside me. What the hell just happened? I turned slowly, my heart pounding. In the snow leading up to where the entrance had been, footprints, not ours. A trail leading out of the empty lot. And they stopped right behind us. If you made it this far, you're braver than most. But tell me, did any of these stories send a chill down your spine? Or have you ever experienced something unexplainable yourself? Share your horror stories in the comments below. I'm dying to read them. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more terrifying tales. And if you're still hungry for more chills, check out the videos appearing on your screen right now. If you dare.